And second, the escalating tensions with Iran. My next guest is the perfect person to talk to you about both of these topics. Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware is a longtime Biden ally and a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Coons, it's great to talk to you.
Always good to be with you, Casey.
Let's start with Iran, because there was that critical meeting at the White House where leaders in your party and across the aisle went to discuss just what is the administration's plan for next steps. In your view, how should the United States respond to Iran in the wake of this drone being shot down?
Well, first, Casey, it's important that we develop and get out the real information about exactly where this drone was shot down. So far, press reports are asserting that the United States has taken the position it was in international airspace over international waters. Iran is taking the position it was shot down over Iranian airspace. In order to help persuade our allies to support us in this particular issue and in other matters that I think will come up soon as tensions rise and then flare up with Iran, it's important that we get those facts out for our credibility. Second, it's even more important that the Trump administration make clear what their strategy is and what their red lines are, because I don't think they've given Congress and the American people a strategy for where they're headed in this rising moment of escalating tensions with Iran. And we don't have clarity, and neither do the Iranians, about what their real red lines are.
So to address the first part of your point initially, do you have reason to believe that the facts that the United States are presenting, the video that the Pentagon put out, all of the things we've been saying publicly, do you have reason to doubt those facts?
I don't. All I'm saying is, given our history in other conflicts in the Middle East, and given the tensions we face with our allies, particularly our vital allies in Europe, it would be a wise move to take seriously that there is some skepticism in the region and around the world. One of the real problems, Casey, with the president's leadership in national security is he has shown a strong tendency to go it alone. And there's been no more striking example than the international agreements painstakingly negotiated over years that he tore up within his first few months as president. The Paris climate deal, the TPP deal, and, of course, the Iran nuclear deal. That, plus our history with Iraq, I think makes it important that we make an extra effort to get it right in this particular case. I have no reason to doubt the American intelligence community. That is, my default, of course, is to believe our own intelligence community, not Iran's. But I'm simply saying this should be a moment where we are making extra effort to get our allies on board with us.
And on the strategy piece of this, we have seen some reporting and some mentions of al-Qaeda and their ties to Iran that suggest that the administration is laying the groundwork to take some action that would be covered by that initial 2001 authorization of use of military force in the wake of 9/11 to deal with terrorist threats. Do you get the sense the administration is preparing some sort of action that would be potentially covered by that? And do you think that Congress should have a say in whether or not there's military action taken here?
I absolutely think Congress should have a say in whether or not we end up in a confrontation with Iran, particularly because of the dangers, the risks, and the costs of our sliding unintentionally into a wider conflict, especially at a moment when we have reason to be concerned about both China and Russia in other places in the world, not to mention North Korea. So given the lessons of Iraq, given the challenges of a relationship with Iran where we have very few channels of communication to de-escalate conflict, and given the very real risks of a miscalculation, and then given the known orientation of the president's national security advisor, who has been sort of banging the drum for war with Iran for a long time, I do think this is a moment where it's particularly important that Congress reassert itself, take action to insist that we have consultation and approval from Congress before there's any move towards a war with Iran.
All right, Senator, let's move and talk briefly about former Vice President Biden, I should say, who is, of course, a longtime ally of yours. You have been a supporter of his from his home state of Delaware. And you've said of this most recent issue that Joe Biden, quote, speaks clearly. Senator Bennett was just on the program a few minutes ago saying that, in fact, Biden should apologize to Cory Booker for the way that he talked to him. Do you think Joe Biden should apologize to Cory Booker?
Casey, I know that Senator Booker and Vice President Biden deeply respect each other and enjoy a solid relationship. What I think matters here is that the former vice president was laying out his strong and clear record on civil rights, which is well known to the American people. They know his character and his heart, alongside his history of being able to work even with senators with whom he deeply disagreed. There's no doubt that Joe Biden fought hard for civil rights the entire time that he was in the United States Senate, and certainly in his role as vice president. But I'll remind you, this is exactly why it matters that those who are running for president put out their best and most positive proposals and record rather than getting into left and right internecine fights. As we move towards these debates in Miami next week, every minute on that debate stage that a Democratic candidate is attacking, challenging, or criticizing another Democratic candidate is a good minute for Donald Trump's campaign. And every minute that we have candidates, as Michael Bennet just did on your show, who puts forward a strong policy proposal for how to deal with the dysfunction in Washington, is a good minute for those of us who care about making Donald Trump a one-term president.
Can I ask you about one piece of Joe Biden's remarks that, frankly, was at the center of what Cory Booker had to say about this? Cory Booker mentioned that Biden said, these segregationist senators, Senator Eastland, he didn't call me boy, he called me son. And Senator Booker said, well, my dad was called boy because he was African American. Do you think that Joe Biden should be more regretful, at least, if not apologize, for using that construction in his language?
Well, Casey, Joe was able to work with folks with whom he had real deep policy disagreements. This story would have been better if he had cited, for example, Orrin Hatch or John McCain, folks with whom he really disagreed over civil liberties, over reproductive rights, but with whom he was able to work on issues on the Judiciary Committee or issues of foreign policy and national security. Joe Biden is not deluded in any way about just how broken our politics are or how obstructionist Mitch McConnell and the Republican majority in the Senate is. He lived through it as the vice president. He got to see the ways in which judicial nominees and important legislative initiatives of the Obama-Biden administration were stymied by the current Republican leadership. All he's saying is that he has a history of being able to work with people, even people who were personally disrespectful to him and to others he cared deeply about. I am hopeful that he and Senator Booker will weave back together what has long been a good and close relationship, and that some of these moments where we're focusing on very small but important misstatements will take less center stage than the fact that we have a president who has said and done things and continues to advance things that, frankly, are gravely concerning to all of us in the Democratic Party.
All right, Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much, sir. Always great to see you.
Thank you, Casey.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.